Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, The Intimacy Lab. I want to ask you something intimate. Have you ever sat across from a woman you love, looked into her eyes and sensed, deep in your gut, that something was slipping away, yet you couldn't name it? Maybe she told you it was stress, maybe she said she needed space, or that she just felt disconnected, but her absence felt like a quiet betrayal long before the truth came to light. This is not just about infidelity, it's about the quiet erosion of trust, the rationalizations we make to protect ourselves, and the stories we tell to soften guilt. Women, too, rationalize their choices, often spinning narratives that soothe their conscience, even while they cause harm. And sometimes, in this web of justification, they become the victim of their own story, even while betraying your trust. Tonight, we're going to gently pull back that veil. We're going to explore 6 of the most common excuses a woman will use to cheat without guilt, and yes, still play the victim in the process. Not to accuse, not to vilify, but to understand this complex human dance of intimacy, betrayal, and self-deception. If you've ever felt confused, hurt, or blindsided, you are not alone, and this conversation may help you see the patterns with clarity and compassion. I want to ask you something intimate. Have you ever sat across from a woman you love, looked into her eyes and sensed, deep in your gut, that something was slipping away, yet you couldn't name it? Maybe she told you it was stress, maybe she said she needed space, or that she just felt disconnected, but her absence felt like a quiet betrayal long before the truth came to light. This is not just about infidelity, it's about the quiet erosion of trust, the rationalizations we make to protect ourselves, and the stories we tell to soften guilt. Women, too, rationalize their choices, often spinning narratives that soothe their conscience, even while they cause harm. And sometimes, in this web of justification, they become the victim of their own story, even while betraying your trust. And so, tonight, I invite you into this delicate, almost uncomfortable conversation. We're going to talk about 6 of the most common excuses a woman will use to cheat without guilt, and still find a way to stand in the role of the victim. But as we do this, I want you to remember, this is not an accusation, and this is not about blaming women as a group. This is about human nature. It's about how people, when trapped between desire and shame, often bend reality to fit their emotional needs. So let's begin with the first excuse, I just wasn't feeling heard. This statement, so simple, so relatable, can be an entry point into rationalizing behavior that crosses boundaries. It's true that many women crave emotional connection, deep listening, and empathy from their partners. And when that emotional intimacy fades, when communication feels dry or absent, it can leave a void that feels unbearable. But here's where it becomes complicated. Rather than confront that void directly, rather than have the difficult conversation and say, I feel lonely even when I'm next to you, some will use this feeling as a justification to seek connection elsewhere quietly, secretly. He didn't listen to me anyway, she might tell herself. So, why should I feel guilty for finding someone who does? In that inner dialogue, she turns herself into the victim not of the affair itself, but of a relationship that she frames as emotionally abandoned. And you, perhaps caught in your own struggles, work, pressure, stress, may not have seen that drift happening at all. You might have assumed she was fine, that everything was fine until it wasn't. So what does it mean when a woman says she wasn't feeling heard? Is it truly about listening, or is it about emotional nourishment that she feels has been absent for some time? It's important to hold this question gently, because sometimes her complaint is a symptom, not the root cause. Sometimes the distance was there long before the infidelity, and the affair becomes not just a betrayal, but also a cry for attention, a way of rewriting the narrative so she can live with her choices. This brings us seamlessly to the second excuse, I was feeling neglected. It's a close cousin to the first excuse, but it carries its own flavor of self-soothing. Neglect is a powerful word. It evokes images of abandonment, of indifference, of being taken for granted. And when someone frames themselves as neglected, it becomes very easy, almost automatic, to justify behaviors that they would otherwise see as wrong. But here's the thing, what does neglect really mean? Sometimes it's very real. You may have withdrawn emotionally or physically, overwhelmed by your own burdens. Other times it's a feeling that grows inside her, a perception that becomes her emotional truth, even if you didn't intend to neglect her. And when that feeling solidifies, when it becomes her dominant narrative, it makes it easier to step outside the relationship and feel justified. I was lonely, she might say, you were never there, and in this statement she absolves herself of the full moral weight of her actions. She frames the cheating not as a betrayal, but as a natural consequence of her unmet needs. It's subtle but powerful, and it allows her to cheat without carrying the heavy burden of guilt, because she believes she was simply filling a void that you created. And I want you to really sit with that, because this is where relationships can become dangerously fragile, when perception replaces reality, when feelings become facts, when stories replace conversations. She may have never truly expressed how neglected she felt. She may have hidden her resentment, her sadness, but once the story is written in her mind, it becomes her truth, and her actions flow from it. Now, as you listen to this, you may already feel the weight of recognition. Perhaps these excuses sound familiar. Perhaps you've heard these words before, in arguments that spiraled into confusion, where no matter what you said, she seemed to twist your responses into further evidence that you didn't care. This isn't about defending yourself or proving her wrong. It's about understanding the deeper emotional mechanics at play. When someone cheats and then plays the victim, they often need a story that protects them from their own shame. That story usually casts you as inattentive, cold, absent, and her as the one left alone, the one who is simply trying to survive her loneliness. So what can you do if you sense this pattern? The first thing is awareness. Recognize that when a woman says she wasn't heard or she felt neglected, she may be expressing a deeper disconnection, but it's also possible that this disconnection became a convenient justification for crossing a line she was already tempted to cross. This is why relational health requires constant tending. The absence of explicit complaints does not mean the absence of dissatisfaction. Silence can often conceal profound loneliness. And here's the hard truth. Even if you did neglect her, even if you failed to hear her, cheating is still a choice, not a necessity. But her story may tell her otherwise, allowing her to both cheat and keep the moral high ground, and so we continue. The excuses will vary, the language will change, but the underlying pattern remains the same. The construction of a narrative that softens guilt, shifts blame, and allows her to remain the hero or victim of her own story. The excuses will vary, the language will change, but the underlying pattern remains the same. The construction of a narrative that softens guilt, shifts blame, and allows her to remain the hero or victim of her own story. And so we arrive at another deeply seductive rationalization. It just happened. This phrase is deceptively simple, almost childlike in its disarming innocence. It just happened erases the deliberateness, the choice, the quiet moments where lines were crossed, emotions entertained, intentions entertained. It suggests spontaneity, as if she were swept up by some powerful current, powerless to resist. But we both know that affairs don't just happen. They unfold over time through glances, conversations, emotional proximity. They creep in during late-night texts, flirtations disguised as jokes, a growing intimacy with someone who isn't you. There are choices, tiny cumulative choices, that precede the moment she crossed that line, yet by framing it as something that just happened, she absolves herself of agency. She steps into the role of someone swept away, someone who didn't intend to hurt you, someone who was a victim of passion, of circumstance, of loneliness. And when she says it this way, she invites you to empathize with her. You may even feel guilty for being angry, because after all, she didn't plan this, right? The reality is that this excuse isn't malicious. It's often a desperate attempt to protect herself from the discomfort of acknowledging that she crossed a line, that she chose this path. And it's easier to paint the picture of an accidental moment than to confront the slow erosion of boundaries that led there. But here's what I want you to remember whenever you hear the words "it just happened." You are listening to a carefully constructed narrative designed to shield her from shame and responsibility. This doesn't make her evil or manipulative, it makes her human. We all reach for stories that allow us to look in the mirror without drowning in guilt. So what happens next? Often, this excuse is followed by an equally common one: you made me feel insecure about myself. This rationalization shifts the blame subtly but powerfully. It turns the affair into a response to your behavior, your criticisms, your absence of compliments, your disinterest. And maybe you did withdraw your affection, maybe you stopped seeing her in the way she longed to be seen. But insecurity is an inside job, and it's never fully about you. When a woman says this, she's often pointing to a deeper hunger, to feel desired, valued, adored. And if she didn't feel that from you, she may have gone looking elsewhere. But by framing it as your fault, she positions herself not as an agent of betrayal, but as a woman responding to emotional starvation. This is such a delicate, complex dance, because even if you did withdraw, even if you forgot to express your appreciation, her insecurity and her choices are still her responsibility. Yet the narrative allows her to stand both as the one who was hurt and the one who hurt you. You see how beautifully tangled these stories become. They create a landscape where guilt is blurred, where accountability is shared in ways that dilute the reality of the betrayal. And when she wraps herself in these stories, she may genuinely believe them, which makes your efforts to prove otherwise futile. You're not just confronting her actions, you're confronting the very story that allows her to live with her actions. This brings us into the emotional terrain where compassion and boundaries must coexist. You can empathize with her need to feel heard, seen, desired, but you must also recognize that these needs, however unmet, never justify betrayal. And I wonder if, as you listen, you're reflecting on moments when you've heard these words before, when a partner seemed to rewrite history so that her actions felt like an inevitable consequence rather than a choice. If that's you, I want you to know that you're not crazy for feeling confused. You're simply navigating a relationship where reality has been re-narrated to ease her shame. The story doesn't stop there. Once the excuse of insecurity is laid down, it often morphs into a more defensive position. At least I was honest about it. This is where she might say, "I told you the truth. I could have kept it a secret, but I respected you enough to tell you." And this sounds noble, it sounds like integrity. But notice what it does. It shifts the focus away from the act of betrayal and onto the act of disclosure. Suddenly, her honesty becomes a kind of redemption. She's asking you to recognize her courage, to see that her confession is proof that she values the relationship, that she respects you enough to be honest even while standing in the rubble of trust. This is one of the most emotionally disorienting moments for many men, because even as you're reeling from the revelation of betrayal, you're being asked to feel grateful for her honesty. And in that swirl of conflicting emotions, shock, sadness, anger, you might even find yourself saying, "Thank you for telling me," even though every part of you is aching. And this is where the conversation must slow down, because honesty after betrayal is not a gift. It's the bare minimum of decency. It doesn't erase the betrayal itself. It doesn't automatically restore trust. And yet, in that moment, it can feel like a gift because the truth has finally emerged from the shadows. So if you ever find yourself in this conversation, if you hear this excuse, I encourage you to breathe deeply and remember, her honesty is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a much harder conversation about trust, respect, and what happens next. And I know these narratives can make you feel trapped. Because when she paints herself as unheard, neglected, swept away by circumstance, insecure, and even noble for confessing, where is the space left for you? Where is your experience of hurt, betrayal, and confusion? This is where emotional clarity becomes so important. You don't have to accept her story as your reality. You can listen with compassion. You can hold space for her feelings, but you must also stay grounded in your own truth. Her excuses may soothe her guilt, but they don't dissolve the impact on you. Her excuses may soothe her guilt, but they don't dissolve the impact on you. And so we step even deeper into this complex landscape of justification and self-preservation, where language becomes a shield and guilt is rewritten as victimhood. Another familiar excuse you might encounter is this: I needed to feel alive again. This one is particularly potent because it touches on something universal, the hunger for aliveness, vitality, excitement. It's not merely about sex or emotional connection. It's about rediscovering oneself, reclaiming a lost part of identity. And when she frames it this way, the affair becomes less of a betrayal and more of a spiritual revival. It wasn't that she didn't love you. It was that somewhere along the way she stopped loving herself. The affair in her mind was not about hurting you. It was about saving herself. This narrative is intoxicating because it elevates the act to something almost noble. It transforms betrayal into self-care, infidelity into an act of survival. I was dying inside, she might say, and this made me feel alive again. And when spoken with vulnerability, these words can disarm even the most hurt partner because they appeal to your empathy, your understanding of the human need for vibrancy and connection. But let's be very clear, while feeling alive again is a beautiful and worthy pursuit, cheating is not the pathway to that. True vitality is not found in secret affairs. It's found in honesty, growth, and confronting the hard truths about one's unhappiness. Yet this excuse allows her to sidestep that difficult work by framing her actions as a personal awakening, something you, in her mind, could never understand because you were the symbol of everything that felt dead. And here's where this excuse becomes especially challenging for you. It's hard to argue against someone's subjective feeling of aliveness. How do you challenge her statement that she was dying inside? How do you push back without seeming cold or unfeeling? This is where many men find themselves emotionally trapped, compassionate enough to understand her pain, yet deeply hurt by the way she chose to address it. But we are not done yet. After this appeal to existential hunger, another excuse often emerges, cloaked in the language of fairness. You weren't meeting my needs, so I did what I had to do. This statement is transactional, pragmatic, and carries the unspoken message that fidelity is conditional, something that depends entirely on your ability to satisfy her emotional or physical needs. In this framing, love becomes a contract. If you fail to deliver, she feels justified in seeking fulfillment elsewhere. And what's insidious about this excuse is that it reduces a complex emotional bond to a simple equation: unmet needs equal justified infidelity. But intimacy is not a transaction, and fidelity is not a reward for good behavior. It is a commitment, a choice made in moments of frustration, loneliness, and longing, not just in moments of pleasure and connection. And when she presents this excuse, she's rewriting the relationship as a conditional arrangement, erasing the deeper covenant you both entered into. Yet this narrative feels persuasive, especially if you've been distant or distracted, if life has weighed heavily on you, and you haven't shown up in the way she wanted. It can make you question yourself: was I really that inattentive? Did I fail so profoundly that she had no choice? But the truth is this: no one cheats because they have no choice. Cheating is always a choice, no matter how unmet her needs may have felt. And when you internalize this excuse, you can begin to shoulder guilt that is not entirely yours to carry. This is where boundaries become essential, not to punish or retaliate, but to protect your sense of reality and worth. You can acknowledge her unmet needs without accepting that betrayal was an inevitable consequence. And as we weave through these excuses, you may start to notice a pattern. Each justification has two functions: to soothe her guilt and to recast the betrayal as something almost reasonable, understandable, forgivable. And if you are not careful, you can become lost in these stories, believing that her unhappiness alone explains her actions, that you are somehow responsible for the choices she made in secret. This is why it is so important to stay grounded in yourself, to know that while relationships can fail us, betrayal is not inevitable or unavoidable. There are always other paths, harder paths, yes, but more courageous ones. Conversation, therapy, honesty, and even the decision to leave before stepping outside the relationship. You are not powerless here. Even if you've heard these words before, even if you feel trapped in her narratives, you can reclaim your clarity. You can recognize the difference between her feelings and her actions, between her dissatisfaction and her decisions. And I want to pause here, because I know that for some of you, these words may feel heavy. You may be recalling conversations where these exact excuses were offered to you, where you felt torn between understanding her pain and honoring your own. That is the complexity of modern love. It requires us to hold space for each other's suffering while maintaining clear boundaries around respect, commitment, and accountability. So, as we move forward, remember this: you can hold compassion for her without abandoning yourself. You can listen to her feelings without accepting that they justify deception. And you can grieve what's been lost without drowning in the guilt that her stories may try to lay at your feet. And isn't that the essence of emotional maturity, to hold two truths at once? She may have felt unheard, neglected, insecure, lifeless, or starved, but none of those feelings forced her hand. The betrayal was still a choice she made, and a choice you now have to respond to. To hold two truths at once, she may have felt unheard, neglected, insecure, lifeless, or starved, but none of those feelings forced her hand. The betrayal was still a choice she made, and a choice you now have to respond to. And this is precisely why the next excuse is so subtle, so psychologically disorienting. We were already falling apart. It's an excuse that doesn't just reframe the betrayal, it rewrites the relationship itself. Suddenly, your entire history, the love you built together, the memories that felt solid and real, they are all placed under revision. The affair becomes not a rupture but an inevitability, an outcome of a relationship that, she claims, was already dying. We were already falling apart can be incredibly seductive as an explanation. It invites you to look backward and find all the cracks you didn't notice. It makes you doubt your experience, makes you wonder if you were the only one holding hope while she was quietly checking out long before the betrayal. But here's the complication. Relationships go through seasons, and all long-term partnerships experience moments of disconnection, distance, and doubt. To say that you were already falling apart before the affair is a way to justify crossing a line rather than working on repairing what was broken. When she says this, she's asking you to accept that the affair was a symptom rather than a betrayal, a symptom of the inevitable unraveling of something that was already on its way out. But inevitability is a dangerous narrative. It removes choice from the equation. It implies that no other option existed, that you were both drifting, and this was simply the natural conclusion. And I want you to hear this clearly. No relationship unravels in perfect symmetry. You may have felt close even while she felt far away. You may have thought you could rebuild while she had already given up internally. Her framing of the relationship as already falling apart is her story. It is not necessarily the objective truth. So what do you do with this excuse? You listen, you acknowledge her experience of disconnection. But you also recognize that disconnection is an invitation to communicate, not to betray. Even if you were struggling, even if things felt distant, infidelity was still a choice, a response to her dissatisfaction, not a foregone conclusion. And there's another layer to this story, one that can leave you feeling even more powerless. Sometimes she will say, "I didn't mean for this to happen, but I was unhappy." This is a softer version of "we were falling apart," but it adds an air of helplessness, as if the affair was something that happened to her rather than something she consciously chose. This is where the narrative becomes slippery, because unhappiness is a powerful justification in modern relationships. We live in a culture that encourages the pursuit of happiness almost at any cost. If she was unhappy, the story goes, then her actions were understandable, even necessary, to restore her sense of well-being. But unhappiness does not remove agency. It does not excuse dishonesty or secrecy. It does not remove the responsibility to either work through the challenges together or walk away before seeking solace elsewhere. This narrative of unhappiness as justification can make you doubt your own role, your own worth. It can make you feel that if only you had made her happier, this wouldn't have happened. And that self-doubt can be corrosive, eating away at your confidence, your sense of self. But the truth is, her unhappiness may have had little to do with you at all. It may have been her own internal struggle, her dissatisfaction with herself, her career, her life, her sense of identity. And the affair became a convenient way to escape that internal discontent without truly facing it. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Often after invoking this narrative of unhappiness, she may circle back to say, "But I still love you." And these words, "I still love you," can be the most confusing of all, because if she loves you, how could she have done this? If she loves you, why did she seek intimacy elsewhere? This is where we must understand that love is not a safeguard against betrayal. A person can love you and still hurt you. A person can feel affection and attachment to you, and yet act in ways that violate your trust. Love alone is not enough. Commitment, respect, boundaries, these are the pillars that sustain love over time. And when she says, "I still love you," after an affair, she's offering a salve, a kind of reassurance that the foundation hasn't entirely crumbled. But for you, those words may feel hollow, even cruel, because they stand in direct contradiction to her actions. And yet you may cling to them, because those words represent hope, a reason to stay, a reason to forgive. And here's where your own self-inquiry becomes crucial. Are you accepting those words because they are true, or because you fear the alternative? Are you holding on to the idea that her love can heal what her betrayal has broken? This is where clarity is essential. Love may still exist between you, but love alone does not heal betrayal. Healing requires ownership, repentance, honesty, not just declarations of affection. As we move through these excuses, whether it's feeling unheard, neglected, insecure, swept away by passion, seeking aliveness, believing the relationship was already falling apart, or simply claiming unhappiness, we see a pattern emerge, a reframing of betrayal as something that happened not because of her choices, but because of the relationship itself, or because of you. But relationships do not betray us, people do, and that distinction matters deeply. When we fail to see this distinction, we risk blaming the relationship for what was ultimately a series of human decisions. And this is why I say, listen carefully to the stories she tells you, understand them, empathize with them, but do not lose sight of the truth that an affair is always a choice. The stories may soften the guilt, the words may feel persuasive, but they do not erase the agency behind the action. And perhaps even more profoundly, these excuses reveal how difficult it is for many people to sit with their own guilt, their own shame. It is easier to rewrite the narrative than to fully own the harm done, but for you, standing here, listening, trying to make sense of what has happened, your task is not to correct her story. Your task is to know your own, to honor your own feelings, to see clearly where responsibility lies. Your task is not to correct her story. Your task is to know your own, to honor your own feelings, to see clearly where responsibility lies. Because if there is anything more painful than betrayal itself, it is the erosion of your sense of self in the aftermath when you are surrounded by her justifications, her stories, her framing of what happened and why, and so we come to one of the most disorienting excuses of all: I didn't want to hurt you. These words can hit like a paradox. How can someone say this after they have already caused harm? How can the intention to avoid hurting you coexist with the reality of betrayal? But you see, in her mind, this excuse becomes another way to rewrite the narrative. I didn't want to hurt you suggests that her intentions were pure even if her actions were not. It invites you to see her not as malicious but as conflicted, struggling, torn between desires, afraid of confrontation. This excuse is designed to soften your perception of her. It paints her as sensitive, empathetic someone who cares deeply about your well-being, even though she has acted in a way that undermines it completely. And here is the emotional trap embedded in this phrase. It shifts your attention from the betrayal itself to her inner turmoil. You are invited to empathize with her struggle rather than hold space for your own pain. This can leave you feeling even more alone. Because now, even as you process your hurt, you are being asked to feel sorry for her, for how difficult this was for her, for how conflicted she felt, for how much she didn't want to cause you harm, but intention and impact are not the same. Even if she didn't set out to hurt you, her actions have left you carrying that hurt. And this distinction matters because it reminds you that empathy for her struggle should not come at the expense of your own emotional reality. And I wonder if you have found yourself in this position before offering comfort to the very person who hurt you, trying to understand her pain even as yours remains unacknowledged. This is what happens when the betrayer becomes the victim in the story they tell themselves. It is a subtle rewriting of roles. Suddenly, she is the one in pain, struggling with guilt, sorrowful that this had to happen. And you, hurt, betrayed, confused, may find yourself pushed into the role of comforter, peacemaker, caretaker. This inversion can be deeply destabilizing. It can make you question your right to feel angry, your right to hold her accountable, your right to take space for yourself. And yet accountability is what restores integrity, not sympathy for her guilt. But even after all these excuses, after I felt unheard, I was neglected, it just happened, I was unhappy. We were falling apart, and I didn't want to hurt you. There is often one final haunting refrain, it meant nothing. This phrase, so cold, so clinical, can be profoundly confusing. It meant nothing is offered as reassurance, as if to say, don't worry, it wasn't about love, it wasn't about replacing you, it was just a moment. But for you, this phrase can land as a further wound. If it meant nothing, then why risk everything? If it meant nothing, why hide it? Why lie? Why betray? This excuse is meant to minimize the significance of the act, to frame it as a momentary lapse, a meaningless transgression that shouldn't matter as much as it does. But this attempt at minimization ignores a fundamental truth. Even if the act itself meant nothing, to her it meant something to you. The secrecy meant something, the dishonesty meant something, the fracture of trust meant something. And this is where betrayal cuts deepest, not necessarily in the act itself, but in what it represents. The affair may have been brief or shallow or casual in her mind, but the breach it creates in the relationship is profound. It means something because it violated an unspoken contract, a shared understanding of loyalty, love, and trust. So when she says it meant nothing, she is asking you to detach from your feelings, to treat the betrayal as insignificant because it was insignificant to her. But your emotions will not comply with that request, and nor should they. Your hurt is valid even if in her mind the affair was meaningless. Your grief is real even if she claims it was an accident, a whim, a distraction. And this is where your dignity must rise, to know that your boundaries matter, that the promises made to you matter, regardless of how she now frames the betrayal. Because here is the ultimate truth about these excuses: they are not designed to heal. They are designed to explain, to justify, to soften, to reduce the emotional distance between you. But they do not repair the fracture. Repair requires something more: radical honesty, deep accountability, empathy that does not center her own guilt but rather acknowledges your pain. And you deserve that kind of accountability. You deserve a partner who does not ask you to erase your feelings just because her story has made sense to her. In this moment, you may feel torn between compassion and anger, between understanding and resentment. This is the complexity of love: to care for someone even as they have caused you pain, to wrestle with contradictory emotions, to feel empathy and betrayal at once. But your task now is not to resolve those contradictions overnight. Your task is simply to recognize them, to sit with them, to honor their presence. You can hold space for the love you once shared while also holding her accountable for the choices she made. And as you do this, you begin to reclaim your own story, not the story she has offered, not the excuses she has made, but your truth, your experience, your reality. This is where healing begins, not in accepting her excuses, but in acknowledging your pain as valid, your hurt as real, and your boundaries as worthy of respect. This is where healing begins, not in accepting her excuses, but in acknowledging your pain as valid, your hurt as real, and your boundaries as worthy of respect. And yet, even as you sit with this clarity, even as you try to honor your experience, there is a final, almost universal dynamic that emerges when someone cheats and then plays the victim. It is the invocation of the phrase, "I've already punished myself enough." This is perhaps the most sophisticated self-protection strategy of all. With these words, she signals that her guilt has been so overwhelming, so painful, so consuming, that she is already paying the price internally. She frames herself as someone who has suffered deeply for what she has done so deeply. In fact, that your anger, your hurt, your need for processing may seem almost excessive in comparison. This phrase disarms you not because it offers a rational excuse, but because it appeals to your empathy, your compassion. It asks you to stop holding her accountable because she is already suffering. In doing so, she positions herself again as the victim, not of your accusations, but of her own remorse. But guilt is not a punishment. Guilt is simply an emotional signal, a reminder of one's wrongdoing. It is not the same as accountability, not the same as repair, not the same as restitution. And yet this statement, "I've already punished myself enough," seeks to end the conversation, to close the book before the real work of healing and rebuilding has even begun. This is where it's easy to lose your footing, to question whether you're being too hard on her, whether you should forgive faster, move on sooner, minimize your own pain in order to comfort her. But forgiveness cannot be rushed simply because the betrayer feels burdened by guilt. Healing cannot be demanded simply because she has begun to feel uncomfortable sitting with her shame. Her internal remorse, however genuine, is not a substitute for repair. And repair requires something far more difficult than guilt. It requires openness, humility, accountability, and a willingness to face the full depth of harm caused. And this is where your strength lies, in recognizing that while her guilt may feel heavy, Your pain is real, and your healing process must unfold at its own pace, not according to her timeline. So we arrive at a kind of crossroads together. You have heard her stories. You have listened to the ways she has explained her behavior, the feeling of being unheard, the loneliness, the need to feel alive, the unhappiness, the claim that it meant nothing. And now even the declaration that she has punished herself enough. And in all these narratives, she may genuinely believe she is being truthful. Her words may not be intended to manipulate, they may reflect her sincere attempts to explain herself to herself. But sincerity does not equal accuracy. She may truly believe her version of events, but that does not mean you have to accept it as your reality. This is where you claim your authorship. You get to decide how you interpret what happened. You get to decide what meaning this betrayal holds for you. You get to decide whether these excuses resonate or whether they simply reveal the many ways people protect themselves from the shame of their choices. And here's the most important truth I want you to carry with you as we close this conversation. Betrayal is not a reflection of your worth. It is not a measure of your masculinity, your desirability, your value as a partner or a man. Her betrayal reflects her choices, her struggles, her inability to confront her own dissatisfaction honestly. It reflects the stories she told herself to justify what she did, but it does not reflect your failure. And this distinction is vital because when betrayal occurs, it's easy to spiral into self-doubt, to question everything, your attractiveness, your attentiveness, your worthiness. To wonder whether you could have prevented it if only you had done more, been more, tried harder, but you were not the author of her decisions. You may have contributed to the relational dynamic, but her betrayal was her choice, and you are not responsible for the stories she used to justify it. And yet, as we hold this clarity, we also recognize that life is not lived in binaries. You can love someone and still know they have hurt you. You can empathize with their unhappiness and still insist that their betrayal was unacceptable. You can honor the history you shared and still decide that this act requires boundaries, healing, and perhaps even separation. This is the complexity of adult relationships. There are no simple villains and no perfect victims. We are all flawed, all struggling, all capable of hurting and being hurt. But in the aftermath of betrayal, your task is not to erase nuance, but to reclaim balance, to honor your truth even as you acknowledge hers, to see her humanity without sacrificing your own dignity. And if you are in this place now, if you are navigating the aftermath of infidelity, surrounded by her explanations, hearing these familiar excuses, I invite you to pause and ask yourself a simple but profound question: what story will I now tell about myself? Because that is where healing truly begins, not in fixing her story, not in disproving her excuses, but in writing your own. A story where you are not diminished by betrayal, a story where your worth is not determined by another's choices, a story where you remain whole even in the face of heartbreak. And as you step forward from this place, I want you to remember this. You can listen to her excuses with empathy and grace, but you are not obligated to accept them as your truth. You can hold compassion in one hand and self-respect in the other. You can forgive if you wish, but forgiveness does not require you to forget your own pain. Your heart, your dignity, your healing, they matter, you matter. So take your time, breathe deeply. Ground yourself in your own reality. And remember that your journey from here is not about carrying her guilt. It's about honoring your experience, your needs, your values. You are worthy of honesty. You are worthy of loyalty. You are worthy of love that does not ask you to shrink in order to soothe someone else's shame. Thank you for sitting with me in this tender conversation tonight. Thank you for your courage to listen, to reflect, and to honor your truth. If this resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your stories because this is a space where we learn from each other's experiences, where we grow together. And if this video helped bring you clarity or comfort, please like it and subscribe to the Intimacy Lab for more conversations like this. Remember, healing takes time, but you are not alone, and even in the wake of betrayal, you can write a story of resilience, dignity, and deep self-respect. Here's to you, your journey, your healing, your truth.